We have Jesse Pratt up next. Jesse, come and share with us. We're going to be, since he's got a long walk, let's just give him an applause for that. Just get in there, man, get in there. Jesse is alongside with me, serving as the systems catalyst. And so he's going to share today why church planning systems are vital for movement. And just a note to Amy Pratt, who's also organizing our XP Awards tonight, 6:30. Don't forget about that. Actually, be there at 6. And she is serving as a co-leader in this with Jesse. So this is incredible what's happening behind the scenes. Drop it.
Thanks, Ed. So, 17 years ago, I rode the same escalator that I rode 2 days ago in the Orlando airport. And I remember coming down that escalator into the area where you rent your cars. And there was a difference this time versus 17 years ago. This time, as I rode down that escalator, I had my wife with me, which was the same as 17 years ago. But this time, as I rode down that escalator, I had my kids with me, which didn't even exist 17 years ago. And as I came down this time and I got to the bottom of that escalator, I saw those chairs that are set up in that area of the Orlando airport, in the area where you rent your cars. And they're like a funny color, but they're really like distinct. And it brought back this wave of emotion when I saw them this time. And it happens every time I come into Orlando, actually. And what I would love to stand here and tell you is that the reason it brought back this wave of emotion, because it was like, oh, this is a good time in my life. But the reality of it was 17 years ago, I was freaked out because I was coming here to do a church planters boot camp. And so here we are in this process. We had this picture in our heads that God had called us to start a new church. And so it was burning in our soul, like this crazy idea that God could use this young couple. And 17 years ago, we were a young couple. I know it's hard to believe. And we had this crazy idea that God could use us. And we had just come off, just a couple of weeks earlier, we had come from a church planters assessment. And we hadn't ever heard of a church planters assessment prior to being told we had to go to one. And so then when we actually went to one, we went and lived in this fishbowl. It was like this crazy pressure. It was just insane. But to just make it even like crazier, we had just walked out, Amy and I had just walked out of a super traumatic personal time in our lives. And so all of that stuff was pressing in on us, and we walk into the Orlando airport and we go over to get our rental car. And as we do, I'm turning back on my cell phone 17 years ago. Flipped open this big giant thing, and it turned it back on, and it said, a message from my district. So I called back and I listened, and it said basically this: hey Jess, there's been a little trouble. We can't rent you a car. You'll have to take care of it when you get there. And so for about, the next 15 hours, we were trying to figure out how two kids with no credit card could rent a car in Orlando. And so that was just one of our pictures, right? Now, as we walk through that story, the reality of it is it's just one portion of a greater story, because somehow God used all of those things to shape inside of us this crazy resolve to see an established church that's a disciple-making church come to pass that would not turn into one church but to multiple churches, and our journey that has led us through all of these things to the place where we stand now. Now, I don't know what your story is, but my sense is you have a similar story, like something has brought you to the place that you are right now, and you have bumps and highs and lows inside of your story. And when I think back on how God used those times, I just became very convinced that somehow God needs to use me and use our movement, inside of our movement, create something that makes this smoother so that we can be more effective at moving from those people who have just a picture. I'm not sure how to use this, honestly. Do we know how to use it? The arrow? Oh, there it is. That moves us from a leader with a calling to a disciple-making church. And there's this gap between that thing burning our soul and this disciple-making church. And I think there's really three things inside of there that help us get there with greater efficiency. And it's a process of discernment, of resourcing, and of support. So I've been tasked with over the last several years, and more specifically in the last few months, to figure out how we can keep getting better and better at discerning, at resourcing, and supporting our planters. You see, when we talk about discerning, a lot of times in our movement, we use the word assessment. And assessment is more than a center that you go to, right? And many of you have been through an assessment center, and I just really believe in the process. It's a wonderful process. But the truth of the matter is, assessment is so much greater than that. You see, assessment starts with a sensing of a call inside of an individual's life. And so at some point, maybe many of you were in a place where you were thinking, maybe God is doing something. I just sense this God is doing something inside of me. So what do? You add that to some trusted leaders, and you begin to speak to some of those leaders, and they begin to affirm that call inside of you. All of this becomes a part of this assessing process. Now, all of that is good and great because we've all met people that are like, I feel like God wants me to do something awesome, and they cast this vision, and your friends are around you, and you're like, yeah, you should definitely do that, right? But then there's this gap sometimes between that call and some of those some of that giftedness inside of those people. And so what we have tried to do is help come alongside leaders and pastors and individuals who are sensing this call, and we've tried to provide some way to help align that giftedness with the thing that God has called them to. Once we move from that alignment of giftedness, we also realize that there's going to be some obstacles. And wouldn't it be helpful to those planters who are dreaming about this thing that's burning in their heart if we could somehow identify what those obstacles might be so that they have a way to be able to navigate past them? That's a process of discernment. We call it assessment. Once we have all of those things come together, it brings us to this picture of a church planter. Once a person's come through that process, now we come out on the other side, and we say, if we have this church planter, is that enough just to say, go do it? Well, no, we need to give them some way to resource them to do it. So we've created foundations that somehow do that. We call those our training centers. And we're working on this right now, and we're super excited about it. We really have 4 areas inside of our training centers that we really want to focus in on. Those 4 areas are the encounter area, the essentials area, expression, and expansion. You see, we don't think that training should just be about a boot camp. Because the truth is, if we're going to have a movement inside of our denomination, then we have to come to a spot where we say we're training people constantly to be multipliers. This is so important. We are called, all of us, to be multipliers. The people that are sitting in your seats every single week are called to be multipliers. See, multipliers are disciples who make disciples. And if we have disciples who make disciples, then we'll eventually have leaders who make leaders. If we have leaders who make leaders, guess what becomes the natural outcome of that? We will have churches who plant churches. And so if we could make sure that we're starting with the people sitting in our seats and giving them an encounter with God that is allowing God to speak into their hearts and soul about the things that He's calling them to multiply. Like, what if we just gave some of the people sitting in our seats the option? Have you ever thought about that? There are people who are church planners sitting in their seats that don't even know it's an option. It's like they go, I don't know that's a thing. And when we suggest that, all of a sudden this becomes a deal. All of that fits inside, in my opinion, sits inside this picture of encounter. The second stage of training that we should do would be essentials. Now, essentials is something that looks a lot like, maybe we've called them boot camps in the past, but I think there's a lot of ways that we can give the essential elements necessary to be successful in launching a new work. So we've looked at maybe some boot camp style, but we also are excited to be able to partner with some other outside organizations. And today I'm going to introduce you in just a minute to a gentleman who is from Gateway Leaders Initiative, and they have a training session that's actually a 9-month-long process where you could sit and soak to get all of the essentials you need to be a church planter. Beyond the essentials, we have the expressions side. Expressions is not just the nuts and bolts, the things necessary for everyone who multiplies, but expression would be what's your context. Because believe it or not every church looks the same. So that's a big surprise, isn't it, right? So what's your context, and how do we take the things we've learned in essentials and move them instead to your context, and so they play out there well? And then finally, what would it look like for us all to be going back through the process and taking the people in the churches that we plant back through and helping them see how God could encounter them, or they could encounter God and ultimately plant and multiply themselves over and over and over. So we have to support them with training. And then the other thing that oftentimes becomes just, it seems almost like a checkbox, and sometimes for planters, I know in my life, this was like that 17 years ago, you have to have a coach. We say that all the time. But the truth is, we don't just need a coach. You know what we need? We need support. We need support in every way. I love what Emily was talking about. And so this is the reality. We need to make sure if we're going to be more efficient at making more disciples to the process of multiplication inside of our movement, then we have to find ways to surround our planters, to surround those on the front lines with a whole network of support. Up here, I've written it as coaching and mentoring and networking. And what that would look like is you would have a coach who helps you with the nuts and bolts of every day, but you would have a mentor that's just walking with you in your life. Maybe that's the pastor of the church that you were called out of, or maybe that's a trusted friend from somewhere around the country. But then beyond that, you need to be networked as a leader with other people that are in the same process as you. All of those things create the support system. And if we could bring all of those things together, that discernment and assessment process, that coaching and networking and mentoring process, and that training process, we would find a greater effectiveness for our planters. So maybe when they come down those stairs, whatever that is or wherever that is in their life, it'll bring a sense of like, that was the time in my life where I was the most supported. That was the time in my life where I felt the presence of God in such a clear way, and I had a plan and a pathway to get there. And so with that, I just would encourage you, thinking locally, at a regional level, and at a denominational level, to lean in to those things that help us more quickly get to the place that God has called us. I'm super excited to introduce Rick Dunn to you. Rick Dunn is from the Gateway Leaders Initiative, and he's not a Wesleyan, so make him feel welcome as a Wesleyan. So Rick, we are partnering with Rick in two ways. Actually, there's Cultivate training, which is this 9-month process. I want you to share about that, if you will. Also, we have a Cultivate coaches training process, which would allow you to, thank you, which would allow you to be trained as a coach, which partners well with the Cultivate training. So the Cultivate coaches training process is 8 weeks. The Cultivate planters training is 9 months. Is that accurate?
36 weeks.
So you're going to share all about that. And so I just really want to give you an opportunity to hear from Rick. There's information in your packets about both of these and how you can find out more information about them. Rick, share with us about those things.
Thank you. Hey, it's great to be an honorary Wesleyan this morning. Thank you. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Well, I want to start out by just sharing 3 facts that you may or may not know about church planting. It's already been well established this morning that church planting is not an easy task, right? And if it were easy, everybody would be doing it, and we would have a much higher success rate at it. As a small encouragement to you, I know you're not happy with your statistics on church planting success, but they're actually better than the average across the U.S. So that's encouraging. But I want to share just 3 facts with you. The first is that the vast majority of church plants in the U.S. are not reaching any new people for Christ. They're simply a regathering of Christians in a new location with no kingdom advance. We already know that the church in the U.S. is in some trouble. More churches every year are closing than are starting new. And so if we're planting churches that are only reaching other Christians, we're in essence kind of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, right? So we need to understand that, and we need to pay attention to that and do something about it. The second fact that I'd like to share with you is that most pastors do not do evangelism. Most pastors do not share Christ with people, believe it or not, other than maybe from the pulpit. And most have no relationships with non-believers. Now you might say, how do you know that? Well, one of the new tools that you guys are going to be using is a tool that we produced and have been using for many years called Church Planter Profile. We've assessed over 18,000 pastors with that tool who want to be church planters. And the most recent statistic is only 38% of pastors who have taken the assessment have led someone to faith in Jesus in the previous 12 months. Only 32% have done anything socially with a non-believer in the previous 12 months. That's how we know that, okay? So it doesn't mean that nothing's happening. I'm just saying most are not really involved in evangelism and don't even have relationships with people who are far from God. The third thing is that in order to be effectively reaching the culture as a church plant, you have to create a DNA and a culture that makes room for those people to be with you, okay? And what we've realized is that the first 100 people in a church plant will set the DNA for that church plant. And if you don't have people exploring faith, a part of that first 100 people, if you grow to 5,000 people, you probably never will. Because it establishes DNA and culture from the very beginning. Okay? So our tools that we are working with you guys on, both Church Planter Profile and Cultivate, Church Planter Training and Launch, are tools that were created to address those very issues in church planting and to allow your 65% success rate to move up to the 90% by addressing these kinds of issues. So Cultivate, as was said, it's an online tool, so it has absolute flexibility. It can be done from anywhere, anytime. The church planter, after going through the assessment process, goes through Cultivate in one of two forms, either as a resident while they're working at another church based on their experience level. If it's felt that they don't have the depth of experience yet to be a lead church planter, then we recommend doing it as a residency for a year first. At the end of that year, they download a playbook, they have all of their tools, the components of their philosophy of ministry, and they go and they plant the church in year 2. The second way to do it is as your church planting process, based on assessment. If a guy has the depth of experience, he's wired as a lead church planter, he goes and Cultivate leads him through the process of launching his church. Typically, the 9-month training fits into a 12-month calendar. That's flexible based on the different components of it. So the key things are every 2 weeks, at least, the planter is meeting with their coach. And the coach is actually walking with them through the training, through the different components, and they're developing their outreach strategy. They're developing their discipleship strategies, all of the different components of their philosophy of ministry leading up at the tail end of the training to the launch process. So, the distinctive, though, of the training is reaching people far from God. It's not an academic training, it's an experience-based training. 60 experiences over 9 months that lead the planter to developing the habits in their life and ministry of engaging the culture, of building a DNA that is reaching out to people and seeing them discipled and grown in the faith of Jesus. So we're really excited. And one of the other just last things I would say is it enables you to develop a consistency across your movement of process. And it is a process that has ultimate flexibility based on the needs of the candidate as well. So, really excited to partner with you and to kind of walk with you guys as you develop this movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you.